The metal hits concrete before he can stop it. Sharp, sudden, wrong. His chest locks. Vision narrows to a pinpoint. The parking lot disappears. Heat rushes in where air should be. Pressure builds behind his eyes. Somewhere distant, a radio murmurs. Tires crunch gravel. Normal sounds, safe sounds. They don't reach him. He's back in the place he never left. Smoke, screaming metal, the weight of something warm going cold in his hands. Count, breathe, ground. The smell of damp asphalt pulls him forward. Oil stains, rust, present, real. His fingers find the truck door handle. Cold steel, solid. He forces air through his throat in controlled bursts. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. The present bleeds back in pieces. A weekend flea market. Cracked parking lot stretching toward a chain-link fence. Folding tables weighed down with bricks and salvage tools. Radios. Extension cords coiled like sleeping snakes. A woman laughing at something her husband said. A child running between stalls. He came here because leaving the house required a destination. Staying home meant staring at walls that knew too much. Going to places where people gathered meant noise, expectations, the risk of freezing in front of strangers who'd ask if he was okay. He wasn't okay. But he was here. That counted for something. The parking lot was better than the grocery store. Open space, easy exit routes. No fluorescent lights buzzing at frequencies that made his skin crawl. Just weathered asphalt, distant voices, the low hum of a generator powering someone's hot plate. He told himself he'd walk the perimeter once. Buy nothing, talk to no one, prove he could still do normal things without the world collapsing. Then he'd go home. The sound of the dropped tool still echoed in his chest, phantom percussion his body refused to release. He breathed through it, pushed off the truck, started walking. Rows of tables stretched ahead, kitchenware, books with cracked spines, a box of cassette tapes no one would ever play again. An old man smoking beside a collection of wrenches, their chrome dulled by decades of use. The air smelled like old cardboard and rain coming. He kept to the edges where the crowd thinned. Near the fence line, where the market gave way to weeds and abandoned pallets, something shifted in his peripheral vision. Movement, low to the ground. Then a voice, not loud, careless, the kind of voice that expected no resistance. He turned toward it without thinking. Instinct older than caution, older than fear. And that's when he saw the rope. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Moments like this don't belong to just one person. The German Shepherd was tied to a rusted post. Full grown, lean in the wrong way, coat matted and dull where it should have gleamed. One hind leg bent at an angle that didn't straighten when the dog shifted weight. Old injury, healed wrong or never treated. Ribs showed faintly when he breathed. A man stood beside the post, holding the rope slack in one hand, scrolling through his phone with the other. Mid-40s, stained jacket, boots caked with dried mud. He glanced up as someone passed, then yanked the rope once. Not hard. Just enough. Useless, the man said to no one in particular. Eats too much, won't guard, won't hunt. $10 and he's gone. The dog didn't react, didn't pull against the restraint, didn't cower or growl or show teeth. He just looked up. The officer felt something crack open in his chest. He knew that look. He'd seen it once before, kneeling in dirt with smoke in his mouth, hands pressed against fur gone slick with blood, watching the light dim in eyes that trusted him, that still trusted him. Even at the end, this wasn't fear, it wasn't pleading. It was awareness, endurance. Still watching, still present. The dog's eyes tracked him as he approached. Brown, clear, calm in a way that felt wrong for an animal tied to a post and offered for the price of lunch. He bite? The officer asked. The man shrugged. Never has. That's the problem. No fight in him. What happened to his leg? Had it when I got him. Don't know. Don't care. The man pocketed his phone. You buying or not? The officer reached into his pocket. His fingers found a crumpled $10 bill. Thin. Almost insulting for a life. He held it out. I'll take him. The man blinked. Surprised. Then snatched the money and untied the rope without ceremony, tossing the frayed end toward the officer like he was handing off garbage. Good luck with that. He turned and walked away before the transaction could complicate. The rope hung loose in the officer's hand. Rough fibers. Stained. He looked down at the dog. The dog looked back. No tail wag. No excitement. Just acknowledgement. Come on, the officer said quietly. The dog stood, slowly, carefully, favoring the injured leg. He limped forward 2 steps and stopped beside the officer's left knee, positioning himself the way a trained dog would, the way a partner would. Rain started as they crossed the parking lot. Light at first, then heavier. Cold drops that darkened the asphalt and drummed against the truck's hood. The officer opened the passenger door and waited, unsure. The dog climbed in with effort, circled once on the seat, and sat, facing forward, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. The officer closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, sat behind the wheel with both hands resting on top of it. His throat felt tight. I don't know why you're here, he said to the windshield, to the dog, to himself, but you're not going back. Through the rain-streaked glass, the dog watched him, still, present. If you've ever felt something broken, recognize something else that's breaking. Hit subscribe, because what happens next will rewrite everything you think you understand about survival. The house sat at the edge of town where the streetlights stopped trying. Single story. Peeling paint. A yard that had given up pretending to be maintained. He'd rented it because it was cheap and far enough from neighbors that no one heard anything they shouldn't. Keys down, jacket off, boots by the door. The dog limped inside and stopped in the center of the living room, scanning. Methodical, left to right, corners first, windows, doorways, exit routes. The officer recognized the pattern. He pulled an old blanket from the hall closet military issue, faded green, soft from years of use, and laid it against the far wall. Not too close, not too far. A position with clear sight lines to the front door and kitchen. The dog moved to it without hesitation, lowered himself carefully onto the fabric, curling around the injured leg. His eyes stayed open. Watching. They spent the first evening like that. The officer sat on the couch with the TV off. No sound except rain against the windows and the occasional creak of the house settling. He didn't try to pet the dog, didn't speak, didn't move closer. 2 survivors sharing the same quiet without touching it. Around midnight, he gave up pretending he'd sleep on the couch and moved to the bedroom. He left the door cracked, a sliver of hallway light cutting across the floor. The dog's eyes reflected green in the darkness. Still watching. Sleep came in fragments. He woke choking on air that wouldn't fill his lungs, heart slamming against his ribs, hands clawing at sheets twisted around his legs like restraints. The nightmare clung to him: heat, smoke, the taste of copper and ash. Somewhere in the house, nails clicked softly against hardwood. The sound anchored him, present, real, proof the dream was over. His breathing slowed. When the nightmare returned an hour later, sharper this time, more detailed, he sat upright, sweat soaking through his shirt, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. The dog stood in the doorway. Not approaching, not retreating, just there. Body angled toward him, head slightly lowered, eyes tracking his movements. It's fine, the officer whispered. His voice sounded hollow, unconvincing. The dog didn't move. Morning came without relief. Gray light filtered through blinds he never fully opened. The dog drank water from the bowl he'd set out but ignored the food beside it. Hunger didn't outrank vigilance. The officer understood that. He made coffee, burnt it, Drank it anyway. Stood at the kitchen window watching nothing happen in the empty street beyond. Behind him, the dog shifted position on the blanket, adjusting, settling, the scrape of nails, the quiet exhale of weight redistributing. Sounds that said, "Still here." The officer's hands shook as he set the mug down. Not from fear, from something older, something that lived in the space between exhaustion and the refusal to stop. He turned and looked at the dog. The dog looked back. No judgment in those eyes, no pity, no expectation of anything the officer couldn't give. Just presence. "You don't know what you signed up for," the officer said. The dog blinked slowly. Once. Deliberate. That afternoon, the officer sat on the floor near the blanket, not touching it, not crossing the invisible boundary, and opened a book he wouldn't read. The dog watched him for a while, then lowered his head onto his paws. They stayed like that until the light changed. Two beings who'd survived things they couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't. Still breathing. Still here. The wrench slipped. Metal struck concrete with a sound that split the world open. The officer's body locked before his mind registered why. Vision collapsed to a tunnel. His lungs forgot how to pull air. The garage dissolved into heat and pressure, the high-pitched scream of something tearing apart, the wet thud of impact, radio static crackling over voices shouting coordinates he couldn't hear anymore. His knees hit the floor. Hands pressed against cold concrete but feeling dirt. Smoke. The weight of someone's vest under his palms. Pulse fading like a signal losing strength. Not here. Not now. Somewhere far away, a dog moved. Nails on concrete. Deliberate. Purposeful. The sound cut through the noise inside his skull. The dog positioned himself between the officer and the open garage door. Body squared, head lowered slightly. Not aggressive, watchful. Scanning the empty driveway like threats might materialize from nothing. Blocking the exit. Creating a barrier. The officer's vision started to clear at the edges. Gray concrete. Oil stains. The wrench lying 3 feet away where it had fallen. No smoke. No blood. The dog shifted his weight, still holding position, still scanning. When the officer's breathing began to slow, shallow gasps turning to deeper pulls, the dog eased back. Not far. Close enough to intervene again if needed. The officer sat on the concrete floor, back against the workbench, hands shaking. "That wasn't luck," he said. His voice sounded wrecked, thin. The dog's ears swiveled toward him, but his eyes stayed on the driveway. The officer watched him. Really watched. The positioning wasn't random. The timing wasn't instinct. Instinct was messy, reactive, panic-driven. This was something else. Precision. He tested it that afternoon. Dropped a screwdriver on purpose. Not hard, just enough to clatter. His chest tightened on cue muscle memory faster than thought. But before the panic could fully lock in, the dog was there. Same position. Same controlled vigilance. Same gradual easing once the officer's breathing steadied. "Who trained you?" the officer whispered. The dog didn't answer. That night, the panic came hard. No trigger, no warning. Just the sudden crushing weight of his own nervous system turning against him. Heart racing. Skin too tight. Air too thin. The bedroom walls pressing closer. He sat up, gasping, hands fisted in the sheets. The dog moved onto the bed without permission. Pressed his body against the officer's side. Not gentle. Firm. Purposeful. Grounding weight that said, "You're still here." Then, the breathing started. Deep, exaggerated, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, deliberate. The officer's body responded before his mind caught up, matching the rhythm without choosing to. In, out, in, out. His hands found fur, coarse, real, warm. The shaking started to ease. Tears came without warning, hot and uninvited. They soaked into the dog's coat as the officer bent forward, forehead pressed against the animal's shoulder, breath hitching in his throat. "You didn't leave," he whispered. The dog stayed solid, breathing, anchoring. Minutes passed, maybe longer. When the officer finally lifted his head, the dog was still there. Eyes half closed now, calm. Like this was normal. Like holding someone together while they fell apart was just something he did. The officer's hand rested on the dog's back. He could feel the heartbeat beneath fur and muscle, steady, unhurried. "You're trained," he said, "aren't you?" The dog blinked slowly. That wasn't instinct. That wasn't luck. Someone had taught this animal how to save people like him. The officer lay back down, one hand still resting on the dog's side. The weight and warmth beside him felt like a promise he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. He closed his eyes. For the first time in months, when sleep came, it didn't drag him under. It let him rest. The dog started eating 3 days later. Not much. A few bites in the morning, a few more at night. But enough. The officer took it as a sign of something trust, maybe, or the slow return of a reason to keep going. He didn't examine it too closely. Some things survived better without scrutiny. They fell into a rhythm. Morning walks around the property line, slow, accommodating the bad leg. The dog didn't pull ahead or lag behind. He stayed at the officer's left knee, adjusting his pace to match. Always the left side. The officer noticed but didn't comment. Afternoons were quiet. The dog on his blanket. The officer pretending to do things that mattered, dishes, laundry, paperwork he'd been ignoring for weeks. They existed in parallel, two separate orbits that occasionally intersected when the officer passed through the room and the dog's eyes tracked his movement. Nighttime was when the boundary softened. The panic still came, not every night, but often enough. And when it did, the dog responded the same way: weight, pressure, breathing, grounding him before he disappeared completely. The officer stopped questioning it, started depending on it. That was when the neighbor showed up. She knocked once, waited, knocked again. The officer opened the door halfway, body angled to block the view inside. Old habit. She was older, gray-haired, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "Thought you might be hungry," she said simply. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine." She held out the dish. "I said you might be hungry." He took it because refusing felt harder. She glanced past him into the house. The dog sat in the hallway, watching, not aggressive, just present. "He's new," she said. "Yeah. Neither of you looks like you're sleeping much." The officer's jaw tightened. "We're managing." She studied him for a long moment, not with pity, with recognition. "My son came back from overseas different than he left," she said quietly. "Took him years to admit he needed help, longer to accept it." She paused. "You're both still here. That's not nothing." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Neither of you is okay," she added, glancing back. "And that's not a failure." She walked away before he could respond. The officer closed the door, set the casserole on the counter, stood there staring at nothing. The dog limped into the kitchen and sat beside him. "She's wrong," the officer said. "I'm fine." The dog's eyes said otherwise. That night, the officer sat on the floor with his laptop. He searched for things he didn't want to find: German shepherds, training programs, behavioral response patterns, deep pressure therapy, PTSD service animals. The more he read, the more the pieces aligned. The positioning during panic attacks, the controlled breathing, the vigilance, the way the dog scanned rooms and held exit routes in his awareness. This wasn't a pet someone had given up. This was a working dog, trained, deployed, then discarded. The officer looked across the room at the dog on his blanket. "Who threw you away?" he asked. The dog's ear flicked, but he didn't answer. Some questions didn't have safe answers. The dog started eating 3 days later. Not much, a few bites in the morning, a few more at night, but enough. The officer took it as a sign of something trust, maybe. or the slow return of a reason to keep going. He didn't examine it too closely. Some things survived better without scrutiny. They fell into a rhythm. Morning walks around the property line, slow, accommodating the bad leg. The dog didn't pull ahead or lag behind. He stayed at the officer's left knee, adjusting his pace to match. Always the left side. The officer noticed but didn't comment. Afternoons were quiet. The dog on his blanket, the officer pretending to do things that mattered: dishes, laundry, paperwork he'd been ignoring for weeks. They existed in parallel, two separate orbits that occasionally intersected when the officer passed through the room and the dog's eyes tracked his movement. Nighttime was when the boundary softened. The panic still came, not every night, but often enough. And when it did, the dog responded the same way: weight, pressure, breathing, grounding him before he disappeared completely. The officer stopped questioning it, started depending on it. That was when the neighbor showed up. She knocked once, waited, knocked again. The officer opened the door halfway, body angled to block the view inside. Old habit. She was older, gray-haired, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "Thought you might be hungry," she said simply. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine." She held out the dish. "I said you might be hungry." He took it because refusing felt harder. She glanced past him into the house. The dog sat in the hallway, watching. Not aggressive, just present. "He's new," she said. "Yeah. Neither of you looks like you're sleeping much." The officer's jaw tightened. "We're managing." She studied him for a long moment, not with pity, with recognition. "My son came back from overseas different than he left," she said quietly. "Took him years to admit he needed help, longer to accept it." She paused. "You're both still here. That's not nothing." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Neither of you is okay," she added, glancing back. "And that's not a failure." She walked away before he could respond. The officer closed the door, set the casserole on the counter, stood there staring at nothing. The dog limped into the kitchen and sat beside him. "She's wrong," the officer said. "I'm fine." The dog's eyes said otherwise. That night, the officer sat on the floor with his laptop. He searched for things he didn't want to find. German shepherds, training programs, behavioral response patterns, deep pressure therapy, PTSD service animals. The more he read, the more the pieces aligned. The positioning during panic attacks, the controlled breathing, the vigilance, the way the dog scanned rooms and held exit routes in his awareness. This wasn't a pet someone had given up. This was a working dog. Trained, deployed, then discarded. The officer looked across the room at the dog on his blanket. "Who threw you away?" he asked. The dog's ear flicked, but he didn't answer. Some questions didn't have safe answers. Not yet. The veterinarian's office smelled like antiseptic and fear. The officer sat in the waiting room with the dog at his feet. A woman across from them cradled a cat carrier. A kid played on his phone, waiting for his parents to finish whatever conversation was happening behind the desk. Normal people doing normal things. The officer's hands were shaking again. He pressed them against his thighs. "Next," the receptionist called. The exam room was small. White walls, metal table. The veterinarian was younger than expected, early 30s, dark hair pulled back, eyes that looked tired in a way the officer recognized. "What brings you in?" she asked. "I need him checked. Don't know his history. Just want to make sure he's okay." She nodded and ran her hands over the dog with practiced efficiency, checking teeth, ears, joints. The dog endured it without protest, eyes never leaving the officer. "Old injury to the hind leg," she noted. "Healed, but improperly. Probably painful on cold days. He's underweight, dehydrated, but stable. Can you scan for a microchip?" She paused, looked at the dog again. "Sure." The scanner beeped as she moved it across his shoulder blades. Once, twice. Then it caught. Faint, irregular, like the signal was struggling. Her expression changed, subtle, but the officer saw it. "This isn't civilian," she said slowly. The words hung in the air. She turned the scanner toward him. Numbers scrolled across the screen. Designation codes, registration information, status flags. Working dog. Military issue. Status. Missing. Presumed deceased. The officer's chest went tight. "What does that mean?" His voice came out rougher than intended. She read further. Deployed overseas. Handler evacuated after an IED incident. Dog unaccounted for. Explosion listed as cause of presumed death. She looked up. "This chip is partially damaged. That's why the signal's weak." The room felt smaller, hotter. "Missing," the officer repeated. "Not dead. Missing." "Yes." So someone stopped looking. The veterinarian didn't answer immediately. She set the scanner down and crouched beside the dog, running her hand gently over his head. "Dogs like this don't disappear on their own," she said quietly. "They're assets, tracked, accounted for. When one goes missing," she trailed off. "Someone took him." She met his eyes. "Or someone let him go." The officer stared at the dog. At the animal who'd been breathing him back to life for weeks now, who'd positioned himself between panic and collapse, who'd been trained to save people and then discarded like he didn't matter. "How does a military working dog end up tied to a fence at a flea market?" he asked. The veterinarian stood. "That's the question, isn't it?" She pulled up records on her computer, typed, frowned, typed more. "There have been incidents," she said carefully. "Dogs retired due to injury or behavioral issues. Some get adopted through official channels. Others," she hesitated, "there's a gap between discharge and placement. Some fall through. Fall through or get pushed." She didn't deny it. The officer's hands curled into fists. Someone sold him. After everything he did, after he got blown up and survived and kept working, someone looked at him and saw $10. The dog shifted, leaned against his leg, warm, solid, present. The veterinarian printed the records, handed them over. "I have to report this. The chip, the status. There are protocols. Will they take him back? I don't know." The officer looked down at the dog, at eyes that had seen things no animal should see, that had survived an explosion meant to kill him, that had been abandoned by the system that created him. "He's not going back," the officer said. It wasn't a question. The veterinarian studied him. "You're not okay either, are you?" "No." "Does he help?" The officer's throat tightened. "Yeah." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe you help each other." She wrote something on a prescription pad, tore it off, handed it to him. "Service dog evaluation. If he qualifies, no one can take him from you." The officer took the paper. His hands were still shaking. "Thank you." Outside, the sky had darkened. Rain threatened. The officer opened the truck door and the dog climbed in, settling into the passenger seat like he'd been doing it his whole life. The officer sat behind the wheel, staring at the paperwork in his lap. Status: missing, presumed deceased. Someone had written this dog off, closed the file, moved on, left him to disappear. But he didn't disappear. He survived, found his way to a fence, waited, and when someone finally looked at him, really looked, he came back to life. The officer started the engine. "You didn't just find me," he said. "Did you?" The dog watched the rain start to fall. "Still here, still watching. If you've ever wondered how many others are still out there waiting, breathing, surviving in the cracks no one checks, leave a comment. Because this story goes deeper than either of them knows." The phone call came 2 days later. An old contact, someone the officer used to work with before the deployment that broke him. Voice clipped. Professional. The kind of tone that meant business without pleasantries. "You still keep your ear to the ground?" "Not really." the officer said. "I'm hearing things. Thought you'd want to know." The officer pressed the phone closer. "What things?" "Warehouses. 3 in the last 2 months. Clean entries. No alarms triggered. Security footage scrubbed." "Very professional." "What'd they take?" "That's the weird part. Not money, not electronics. Equipment, training materials, medications used for sedation." A pause. "And dogs." The officer's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of dogs?" "Working breeds. German shepherds mostly. Belgian Malinois. A few others. All with prior training. All sold or rehomed recently through unofficial channels." The pieces started clicking together. Too fast, too sharp. "You think it's organized?" "I think someone's running a pipeline, taking trained animals and moving them. The question is where and why." The officer looked across the room. The dog was on his blanket, watching. Always watching. "How long has this been going on?" "Hard to say. Could be months. Could be years." Someone finally noticed the pattern. "Who's investigating?" "Officially. No one yet. Not enough evidence. Not enough priority." The voice softened slightly. "I remembered you had a thing for the K9 units. Thought you'd want to know." The call ended. The officer sat in the silence that followed, his mind racing through timelines, deployment dates, evacuation records, dogs listed as deceased when they weren't. Dogs that fell through administrative cracks because no one was watching. Someone was watching. Someone was taking advantage. He pulled up his laptop, started searching. Not official databases he didn't have access anymore, but public records. Adoption agencies, private sales, forum posts from handlers looking for retired partners. The gaps were there if you knew where to look. Dogs, discharged for minor injuries. Behavioral issues that didn't match the animal's history. Transfer paperwork that led nowhere. Shelters that received animals with no background information and rehomed them quickly. Too quickly. The dog had moved closer without him noticing. Sitting beside the couch now, head tilted slightly. "Someone did this to you," the officer said. "Didn't they?" The dog's ear twitched. That night, the officer couldn't sleep. Not because of nightmares, because of anger. Clean, focused anger that felt almost like purpose. He'd spent months drowning in his own failure, replaying the moment he froze, the decision that cost a life, the weight of inadequacy that followed him home and never left. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something systematic, something that looked at trained animals who'd served and survived and saw profit instead of debt. He got up, paced. The dog followed, limping slightly, staying close. "I can't fix what happened over there," the officer said. "Can't bring anyone back. Can't undo the freeze." The dog sat. "But maybe I can do something about this." He looked at the records spread across his coffee table. The veterinarian's notes, the microchip data, the phone number for the service dog evaluation. Pieces of a puzzle that was bigger than one discarded animal. The dog started eating regularly after that. Not just a few bites, full meals. Like something inside him recognized that survival wasn't just about endurance anymore. It was about what came next. The officer made calls, quiet ones, to people who might listen, who might care. He documented what he found, built a file that connected dots no one else was connecting, and every time the panic started to creep back in, every time his hands shook or his chest tightened, the dog was there. Breathing, grounding, reminding him that broken things could still be useful. That discarded didn't mean done. That somewhere between survival and surrender, there was still work to be done. The call came at 2 a.m. "Need an extra set of eyes. Unofficial. You available?" The officer recognized the voice. Same contact, different tone. Urgent this time. "Where?" An address. Industrial district. Warehouses near the rail yard where legitimate business stopped pretending. He almost said no. Almost. But the dog was already standing. Alert. reading the shift in the officer's body language the way he read everything else. "I'll be there in 20. They drove through empty streets, streetlights casting orange pools on wet asphalt. The dog sat in the passenger seat, nose slightly raised, processing information the officer couldn't access. The warehouse district was dark, except for scattered security lights, loading docks, chain-link fences, buildings that looked abandoned but weren't. His contact waited in an unmarked car near the perimeter, waved him over. "Tip came in an hour ago. Possible location for one of the missing shipments. Can't get a warrant without more evidence. So you need probable cause. I need someone who can walk a dog and see what happens." A pause, unofficially. The officer looked at the dog. "He's not certified, not official. Neither are you, not anymore." The words stung because they were true. They moved in on foot, quiet, slow. The officer's training came back in pieces. Spacing, angles, environmental awareness, things he thought he'd lost. The dog's behavior changed as they got closer. Posture shifted, nose working, not random, purposeful. He pulled slightly toward a side entrance, not hard, just insistent, and stopped at a service door that looked sealed. "Something here?" The contact whispered. The officer knelt, ran his hand along the door frame. Fresh scratches, lock recently forced. The dog sat, focused, waiting. They called it in. Backup arrived. Official personnel breached properly. Found crates inside, medical equipment, sedatives, paperwork with dates and transfer codes that shouldn't exist. And in the back corner, 3 dogs in cages. German shepherds. 1 Malinois, all young, all trained, all scheduled for disposition, according to documents that didn't specify what that meant. The officer stood in the warehouse afterward, watching the animals get loaded into proper transport, handlers speaking softly to them, offering water, checking for injuries. His contact approached. "That dog of yours knew." "Yeah." "Where'd you say you got him?" "Flea market. $10. Guy said he was useless." The contact looked at the dog, at the calm, watchful eyes, the precise positioning beside the officer's left knee. "That's not a useless dog." "No," the officer agreed. "He's not." They drove home as dawn broke, gray light bleeding into the sky. The dog's breathing had changed, deeper, more settled, like something inside him had clicked back into alignment. Purpose, not just survival. The officer felt it too. That dangerous flutter of meaning returning to a life that had felt empty for so long. "We did good tonight," he said. The dog's ear flicked forward. At home, the officer poured kibble into the bowl. The dog ate without hesitation, stood afterward and moved to the couch where the officer sat, pressed against his leg, warm, solid. "You brought me here," the officer said quietly, "didn't you? Not just to the warehouse, to this, to something that matters." The dog exhaled slowly. Outside, the neighborhood woke up, cars starting, doors closing, people beginning days they'd finish. Normal lives for normal people. Inside, 2 survivors sat together, no longer just enduring, beginning something that looked almost like healing. The steel door slammed. Sharp, metallic, final. The officer's body locked mid-step. Vision collapsed. Air vanished. The warehouse dissolved into heat and smoke and the high-pitched ringing that came after explosions. His hands were shaking. No, his whole body was shaking. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't. The dog moved into his field of vision, positioned himself directly in front, blocking everything else. Body squared, eyes locked on his. The officer tried to pull air into his lungs. Failed. Tried again. The dog pressed forward. Firm, deliberate, pushing his weight against the officer's legs, grounding, anchoring. Then the breathing started. Deep, exaggerated, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The officer's body responded automatically. Matching, in, out. His hands found fur, coarse, real, present. In, out. The ringing started to fade. The smoke cleared. The warehouse came back into focus, concrete floors, fluorescent lights. His contact standing near the exit with concern written across his face. "You good?" the contact called. The officer's throat was tight. His legs felt weak, but he was still standing. "Still here." "Yeah," he managed. "I'm good." It was the first time he'd said it and meant it. The dog eased back slightly but stayed close, watchful, ready to intervene again if needed. But the officer didn't need it. He took another breath on his own, slower, controlled. His hands were still shaking, but his mind was clear. He'd frozen, and then he'd come back. Both things were true. In the truck afterward, the officer sat with his hands on the steering wheel, not gripping, just resting. "I didn't disappear," he said quietly. The dog looked at him through the darkness, brown eyes reflecting streetlight. "I froze, but I didn't disappear." For months longer than that, maybe years, he'd believed the freeze defined him, that the moment he failed was the only moment that mattered. That being broken meant being useless. But the dog had shown him something different. Broken things could still function. Trauma didn't erase capability. Survival wasn't the same as surrender. "You brought me back," the officer said. His voice cracked slightly. "You kept bringing me back, even when I didn't want to be here." The dog shifted on the seat, leaned against him. Warm, solid, real. Tears came then, quiet, unhurried, not the desperate kind that came with panic, the releasing kind. The kind that happened when something inside finally let go of weight it didn't need to carry anymore. "I froze," he whispered. "And people died because of it. That's not going away." The dog's breathing stayed steady. "But I'm still here, and you're still here. And tonight we found dogs who weren't going to make it. We did that." His hands rested on the dog's back, feeling the heartbeat beneath fur and muscle. "Both things can be true," he said. "I can carry what happened and still be worth something." The drive home was quiet. Inside, the officer made tea he wouldn't drink and sat on the couch. The dog climbed up beside him, something he'd started doing recently, permission assumed rather than asked. The officer's phone buzzed. Text from his contact. "Good work tonight. You thinking about coming back?" He stared at the message for a long time. Coming back meant facing things, meant admitting he needed help, meant accepting that he'd never be what he was before, that the officer who deployed wasn't the same person who came home. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the person who came home was the one who could do this work, who understood what it meant to be broken and functional, who could sit with others drowning in their own minds and say, "I know, me too. We're still here." He typed a response. "Maybe. Limited capacity. No promises. That's all anyone's asking for." The officer set the phone down, looked at the dog beside him. "You saved my life," he said. "You know that?" The dog's eyes closed slowly. Peaceful. "No," the officer corrected himself. "You gave me a reason to save my own." Outside, rain started to fall, soft, steady. Inside, two survivors breathed together. Still watching. Still here. Still becoming something neither of them expected. The paperwork came through on a Tuesday. Official designation. Service animal. Working status maintained. Dual certification that meant no one could question, no one could take him back. The officer stood in the small office where it was finalized, holding documents that felt heavier than paper should. "He's yours," the administrator said. "Legally, officially." The officer nodded, throat too tight for words. Outside, the dog waited by the truck, patient, watchful. They drove to the flea market without discussing it. The place looked the same. Cracked asphalt, folding tables, the smell of old things waiting for new purpose, but the fence line had changed. The rusted post was gone. The weeds had been cleared. Someone had installed a proper barrier. Clean. Maintained. The officer stood where the post used to be, where he'd handed over 10 crumpled dollars and taken responsibility for a life no one else wanted. "You were never useless," he said quietly. The dog sat beside him. Not because he was commanded, because he chose to. The officer returned to work a week later. Limited duty, advisory role. He sat in a small room with other officers who hadn't slept well in years, veterans whose hands shook during certain sounds, people who understood what it meant to carry pieces of war home in your chest. The dog lay at his feet, breathing slow, present. "I froze," the officer told them. "I still freeze sometimes, and then I come back. Both things can be true." Voices lowered when they spoke, shoulders relaxed slightly. Someone asked about the dog. "He's working," the officer said, "like me." The dog became a fixture, not a mascot, a presence. Water bowls appeared outside shops without discussion. Children asked to pet him and were taught proper approach. Handlers from the K9 unit stopped by to observe his behavior, taking notes. One evening, a young officer approached, fresh from overseas, eyes hollow in a way the older officer recognized. "Does it get better?" the young officer asked. "No," the officer said honestly, "but you get stronger at carrying it." The dog shifted, leaned against the young officer's leg, just enough pressure to matter. The young officer's hands found fur. His breathing slowed. "Yeah," he whispered. "Okay." Some nights were still bad. Panic still came. Nightmares still waited. The officer still woke, choking on air that wouldn't fill his lungs. But when it happened, the dog was there. And when morning came, the officer got up. Both things were true. In the space between survival and surrender, something had taken root. Not healing, not forgetting. Purpose. The quiet kind that didn't announce itself. That showed up in small rooms and late nights and moments when someone else needed to know they weren't disappearing alone. The officer looked at the dog sleeping on his blanket, chest rising and falling, still watching, even in dreams. "Thank you," he said. The dog's ear flicked. They were still here, still breathing, still watching for others who'd fallen through the cracks. And somewhere in the system that had failed them both, something was beginning to shift.